I'm Renee.
I'm Mike.
I'm Rhett.
And we're Ministry Chemistry.
Here we go.
Welcome back to another episode of Ministry Chemistry, where today we have a very special guest with us. It is our behind-the-scenes producer, Aaron.
Hey.
I know Aaron's never been on this show. This is very exciting.
I'm thinking, can we count Aaron as a guest? I mean,
I don't know.
You're technically a part of every week's show. It's like not on the
just
air.
Unknown, unseen.
I am always present.
Unheard. Omnipresent Aaron.
As Aaron puffs his chest out. These are the times when we need video podcasts.
I know. And I realized on one of a recent episode that we did, I said to all of our viewers, like we're on a television show, and like I'm Oprah, so welcome, Aaron.
Yeah, you get a card.
Aw, you guys are so cute.
Aren't we? They wouldn't know because there's not video.
Brad and Aaron actually work together at the same church. How long have you guys worked together?
4 years, almost.
Almost 4, 3.5, yeah.
Okay, all right. Now, does Aaron report to Brad or does Brad report to Aaron? How does that work?
Neither.
Depends. Technically, Brad's multi-talented. He sings. He does a lot of other things. So as the music person, we work together closely. So technically, in that regard, he works for me.
We're co-conspirators.
In that way. No.
I like how Brad's still like, it's collaborative. And Aaron's like, he works for me.
Only in that regard, no.
This is how that goes down.
All I heard just now was, we're even, but I'm your boss.
No, he's a wonderful volunteer as well. That's all.
Yes, an unpaid volunteer. Some of the best people are.
I'm a 9.
It's fantastic. Well, that's true.
No.
Yes, for any Enneagrammers out there, Aaron is a 5, even though he hasn't studied the Enneagram. We know this because he's an investigator.
Oh boy.
It's such
and
a
you're
beautiful
gonna hear
gift
a lot
to the
about
world.
that today.
That's right. Aaron, what do you do on the daily for the church? Like, what's your title or role?
Director of Music and Worship.
Okay.
And I also teach some classes occasionally. I've started doing that more recently. Right now I'm teaching a class on the history of Christian music in church and culture, 1950 to 1999. We're live streaming a class, and we're doing a multimedia class on, the Amy Grants and the Larry Normans and
Sandy
all that
Patty?
stuff. Sandy Patty.
Twyla Paris?
Twyla Paris. We just did Twyla Paris. You can go check it out at picnaz.org/CCM.
Yeah.
All resources.
I didn't know this until this moment exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And now I'm going to go
So
do that.
we're going to have we just did 8 sessions. We'll have 12 to 13 sessions walking through that history with all the media, video, everything.
Has Carmen's
Carmen's
been a
next
topic?
week.
Yes.
So.
And if you're listening to this podcast, that means it's probably 2 or 3 weeks past. So just so you know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
We will link that in our profile.
See, look at that. There we go.
I haven't been to any of the classes, but I've noticed you've had a lot of fun basically jam sessioning through the passing of the plate to introduce what type of music you're going to be studying.
Oh yeah,
week.
we've done a few offertories where we did Larry Norman's "Sweet Sweet Song of Salvation" from 1969.
I want to hear a high na na na.
Yeah,
man.
one of the na 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 na. Yeah, we did all that stuff, and Mylon Lefebvre's "Old Gospel Ship," which is his kind of southern rock cover of an old traditional gospel tune.
Man, that is so fun.
So we've had some fun. We're going to be doing the Love Broke Through, which Keith Green wrote along with Randy Stonehill and a few others that Phil Kagi also recorded. We'll do a version of that soon. So we're doing a lot of fun. We're having a lot of fun.
For anyone listening who's never heard of any of these names or titles or songs, but if you know Chris Tomlin or Matt Redman or, even Stephen Furtick's a songwriter, which that's
what?
Yeah, Stephen Furtick is a songwriter. He's a co-collaborator on worship songs.
I thought he was just a heretic.
Mike. But anyway, all of these folks that Aaron is talking about, they were the precursors to who you know today. And I think folks today would say that, growing up and listening in the 90s and the 80s to these folks.
So that's part of what I'm doing is teaching a class like that. But
my mom
it's
will love
mostly music.
checking that out
Yeah,
online.
it is
so
cool.
This is great.
It works well online. So.
But listeners, that is not why Aaron is here today. Not to talk about worship and music necessarily. However, he offers a very interesting perspective on the topic we're going to discuss today, which Brad is pretty well versed in because he just talked to teenagers about this as well.
We did. If you, over the past, I guess, 6 weeks or so, have heard of Rhett and Link. They have quite a few, meaning 160 million followers on YouTube. And they have a couple of different podcasts, one of which is Ear Biscuits. on their Ear Biscuits podcast, they deconstructed their faith a few weeks ago, and we talked about it last night with our teenagers, just in a safe space of how it's good to. It's not good to have doubts, but it's good to air those doubts out in a safe space, ask questions, and search for the answers yourself. And so Rhett and Link both took a week and deconstructed their own faith, and it was quite compelling to just hear their points of view coming from a very fundamentalist background in North Carolina, and how not getting answers from the church kind of led them down a road away from the church. So
what do they call themselves now? Because they wouldn't say they're Jesus followers or Christian now, right?
Rhett would, he considers himself a hopeful agnostic.
Okay.
And if you don't know what an agnostic is, basically it's belief in a higher being, but not necessarily God.
Singularly defined.
Right. I hesitate to use the verbiage, but basically narrowly focused. Like, as Christians, we're somewhat narrowly focused, and we believe there's only one path to God and salvation, and that's Jesus. But agnostics kind of are okay with across the board, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever. There's many paths to God.
And I think you could use the word agnostic in respect to certain things. You might be agnostic in respect to which religion, but not agnostic about God. Or you could be agnostic about God and theism in general. And so I'm not sure if there's a God or not, which would be different from I'm not sure which God is correct. So I'm not sure that if they explicitly said in which respect they're agnostic. I read that as agnostic regarding the God of theism.
Well, Rhett kind of talks about sort of, and we clipped this last night for the teens. He talks about, like, I think it's reasonable to believe that there is a God.
Okay.
Now, who that is or what that looks like, I don't know. And I'm using Rhett's words here.
Sure.
And he also talks about it's rational, it's reasonable to believe that there is a greater purpose to the universe. Like, we're not just spinning in space,
right.
Undefined or whatever. So I would call that the other version of agnosticism.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is probably capturing his
just
position.
based on what he said.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But, I mean, it's definitely a little bit of a leap from fundamentalist Christianity to hopeful agnostic. And one of the reasons, like, I was excited about having Aaron on the show is because we talked about this earlier this week, and Aaron wasn't familiar with it at all, somewhat familiar with the names Rhett and Link. But he was like, hey, text me that video, and I texted him, and he spent some time watching it and processing. But, Aaron, your feedback for the video was a little different than what Brad and I's initial reaction was in prepping for a youth group conversation. So
what were Brad and Mike, what was your initial reaction? And then I really want to hear what was Aaron's.
Honestly, I had to fight the urge not to tear it apart. And
as in, like, push back and
well, one of the things I told Brad, so they've done some follow-ups, they've done some Q&A about this, and they seem a little, Rhett and Link I'm referring to, they seem a little frustrated with the pushback they've gotten, and I'm like, you deconstructed the faith of 1.5 billion people. You're going to get some pushback on that, know? And that was my initial reaction, and I think part of that was there's not as staunch, but a little bit of fundamentalism in my faith background, and I kind of went through a somewhat similar process of them, but I didn't go the deconstruction route. I went the exploratory route and built up a faith. I built my faith beyond believe just because. I wanted. That's one of the things I love about our denomination is there's reason, there's rationality to faith. It's not just blind faith. So, having gone through that process myself, I wanted to deconstruct their deconstruction.
Sure.
Aaron, your mind didn't necessarily go there. What was your initial reaction?
My initial reaction was it was a gut punch because I know that our teens ask those kind of questions. They're asking those kind of questions. So when I was listening, I was like, we have to talk about this. And we have to talk about it in an open way and not shove answers down their throat, but we need to have a conversation so they know it's an okay place to explore these questions and not have them grow to a point where they're referencing Wikipedia pages to support their argument that there is no God or there is we come from apes. So my initial reaction was, let's get this out in the open and not act like it didn't happen or that we can't ask these questions. It's just safer not to ask these questions, which it is safer not to ask the question.
It is.
Especially when you're a youth leader. But
gutsy move. I was so floored when I realized you are talking about that in youth group, which is props, by the way. I just think.
Yeah. Did you give anyone a heads up? Hey, we're going to talk about this, or this was just a topic of the
night? Our youth leaders.
Yeah.
I sent them the clips we were going to use, and before we got things rolling last night, I just said we can't throw answers at them. Let's ask more questions than answers.
Good. We love that.
Let's not over talk. Let's let them speak into, and we'll direct as needed. But I didn't give their parents a heads up on it. And really, I think some of the other, I let Aaron in on it yesterday afternoon. I let our associate pastor in on it too. And everybody seemed to be really positively thinking about it and saying, yes, this is what we need to do. So
isn't it funny that we are still in a place in 2020 where it's like, hey, just a heads up, we're going to introduce the topic of how a couple people walked away from faith to your kids. Is that okay? When people walk away from faith or are uncertain about their faith all the time and all around us, and yet there's this hesitancy that if we talk about it in the open and bring it into the light and actually acknowledge it exists, that we're somehow going to encourage a kid to walk away by talking about it.
I think it's inherently dangerous.
To talk
if
about
you're
it.
genuine, if you genuinely engage and you genuinely listen, you become vulnerable. And quite honestly, and again, it is a risk, and it's a risk you have to take. You know, or do you stay in the boat or do you get out in the water? And I think that's a beautiful thing about it.
The risk.
It's a beautiful thing about the risk. It's the only way you mature and grow.
Right.
But there are people who won't manage and handle that situation very well.
Sure.
And so it is a risk.
So
it's a necessary risk.
One of the things,
it is a necessary risk.
I think it's necessary.
One of the things I was going to say, and I'm glad you went there. You both said it's safer not to talk about it. But I would almost push back and say, with this story coming out, it seems just as unsafe to not talk about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it is very public.
Yeah, it's kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't type deal. You know,
I think it's more. I think probably the safety aspect is as a leader of this group, it's safer personally not to dive into that rather than being vulnerable enough to go there. But in the position I hold, to some extent, I'm taking my job, my livelihood, in my own hands, risking that conversation because of the backlash that could come as a result.
Right.
Well, and where my brain goes is let's parallel this to something outside of a faith-based context. And it's going to sound a little big and dramatic maybe, but the Me Too movement, right? There was a risk in saying this happened to me. And then there was a bigger risk in companies, corporations, organizations, even families saying, has this ever happened to you? Right? To ask the question makes people think and consider or remember, but it doesn't change what has already happened. Yeah. So bring it back to the faith-based context. A kid sitting here on a Wednesday night that has a doubt, that has a question, but is too afraid to ask. And then Brad steps up and says, hey, we're going to talk about this question. That kid goes, oh, somebody else has it. Somebody else says it's okay to ask it. It doesn't mean they never had the question.
Right.
It now means they're not alone in having the question and having to wrestle with it. And that is a gift that more churches and safe spaces need to bring to people of all ages, honestly.
Sure. I was thinking, like I said, I had to pull myself back from defense mode because I wanted to process and think about this open-mindedly. Aaron, your mind went completely different initially. So share some of that.
I mean, I thought my first reaction was that was beautiful. That was one of the best moments on YouTube in a year. I consume a ton of YouTube through podcasts, Rogan, Jordan Peterson, whoever, faith-based stuff, listened to lots of, theological debates, whatever it would be. I thought this was one of the best sustained articulations of that deconstruction journey away from faith, which, not because it's beautiful because he walked away from faith in that sense, or faith in a certain respect, I would probably rather say, but that we got an instance of the inner life journey in a way that we rarely do. And because it was from people who are very churched, it's going to resonate a little bit different from people who are churched. They're going to be able to relate a little more. I don't think he was disingenuous at all. I don't think he was trying, I think it was just a beautiful discussion of the journey that was authentic, and I thought was exactly what the church does not have on average. And this is, to me, listening to that was church. I've been to church. I am in a church. That was church. Everything else was formula compared to that. That was church.
I love that you say that, because this is going to sound so silly. I know. I'm a Broadway fan, and I was watching the opening of the Tonys a few years ago. And when I was watching the opening of the Tonys, there was this moment of song that I was like, that phrase is scripture. It's not, nobody stop listening. I'm not trying to blaspheme the holy word of God, but the sentiment, the truth that it held, I mean, it just screamed Jesus. It just screamed authenticity and love and reality that I want anyone who knows Jesus to know. In the Tony Awards, which sounds so ridiculous, I know. So I understand what you're saying when you're like, there was something very Holy Spirit driven potentially to this piece of his story.
Yeah, I just think,
even though the Holy Spirit wouldn't guide you away from himself.
Right. But so, however you want to talk about it in that sense, I resonated with that level of authenticity about tough spiritual questions that I think, quite honestly, in an increasingly secular age, need to become the way we express our faith and talk about our faith. It needs to include more than, the formulas of our denomination or even of our religion. Not because we can't have denominational or religious distinctives, certainly should. But this should become more the new normal of the type of engagement. And I think the way he talked about that process was just a good step. And it just reminded me of how, in my view, we need that conversation through and through in the church. So
I have a side note to add, and this it's related, but it's just something maybe someone will benefit from. So Aaron and I, we shared this and we commented back and forth in a group chat. But I loved hearing your explanation of why you use the descriptor. That was beautiful. That didn't come through in a group chat. So if anyone is processing and they're on opposite sides of the fence on an issue like this, have that discussion face to face. That's right. Because too many people hash that online, and I knew that Aaron would have a much better description. So I was like, hey, let's talk about this face to face. And it makes it so much clearer.
I didn't know it was going to be on a podcast, but that's
great.
No, yeah.
But that's okay.
No, it's good.
I'm just thinking, there's a lot of people tearing down this deconstruction, which is not constructive.
Sure.
Because they're doing it in a place where it becomes one-sided. And I get the temptation to do that because you're never going to sit down across the table from Rhett or Link. Odds are you're not going to. It would be like us inviting Jimmy Fallon to be on this podcast. FYI, Jimmy, we would love to have you.
Yeah, Jimmy, it'd be a great conversation.
But you know what I mean? Like, it's just things get lost in translation. And, these guys had a limited amount of time. They had an hour and a half each to share basically a lifetime journey of faith. Mm-hmm. There's so many more layers to that onion that we will never get at.
Sure.
And it's easy for us to sit here and pick it apart or hold it up on a pedestal, whatever your choice is. But these conversations are so much better had like face to face. And that was the goal of last night with a group of teenagers.
And where's the walking with? Where's the, as grown adults, scholars, seminarians, professors, pastors, whatever role someone holds or title, I guess, at the core and the crux of discipleship is a walking with. And so if there's ever an honest and sincere hope that Rhett and Link might turn back around, they're going to need folks who are walking with them through a season where they're like, I don't know if I'll ever turn back around. But gosh, Mike Roberts stayed with me. And that was a helpful voice and friend during a season of me not knowing where I stood with a God.
That's kind of where we ended things last night is we played 2 separate clips, one of a journal entry before they finally decided to walk away, and then just where he is now about not needing to have certainty. And just left it at, we're on a journey. And right now their journey is away from God. But there's still a hopefulness in their receptivity of him working that they could end up back on track, on quote unquote track. And we would all love our journeys to be a straight line, but none of them are.
No.
And theirs just happens to be away right now. And that doesn't mean that's the end.
And see, I would, to interject there, when you say the journey away from God, I would disagree in that sense because to me, they said something about truth matters more, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, whatever. If God,
You just whatever Jesus.
No, just that phrase.
You're welcome.
Yeah. That didn't come off well. Fired. No, just kidding. Anyway, but I think honestly seeking truth in the spirit that they seem to be doing that. I'm not going to know their motives. I don't think is walking away from God. I think it's walking away from certain ways of talking about God. Now, certainly that is, ways we like to talk about God kind of thing. But to me,
safe ways, honestly.
Safe ways. And the formulas and the dogmas matter for a community of believers to be on the same page and so on. But I don't see their journey away from God in this kind of, I'm shaking my fist at God in this respect. I see that this simply as a deeper dive into God, honestly. And quite honestly, what I felt was those that do not pursue truth like they do are lukewarm. And that is the status of most. This is coming from someone who has plenty of flaws. But one thing that I'm sensitive to is I do not see the church genuinely seeking truth. And I think in many respects are lukewarm in that way. And I thought that's a more genuine expression of faith going quote unquote away from God, because I think God's bigger than that and we can't flee from God. And I don't think they are. I see that as a deep dive, and I think more people ought to go at it that's my view, that we should be doing more of what they are doing, as risky as it is.
So anyone who's listened to us for any amount of time knows I'm a big fan of Pastor Andy Stanley out of Atlanta. And he has said in recent years a lot that he finds deconstructionist stories fascinating. Not in a, yay, they walked away, but where he's come to a place of is, yeah, if that version of Christianity, if that picture of Jesus was painted for me, I wouldn't be a Christian either. I would have walked away as well. And so to your point about authentically seeking truth away from a formulaic approach, I think there is a soft heart before a Lord, even if they're not able to acknowledge that's the Lord right now.
So
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
I have two comments. One, I do believe that as Christians, if we believe that the earth and all that is in it is God's creation to some degree or another, then we should be able to find an inkling of truth in all those things as we explore them in more depth versus like just shutting the door on everything. So I appreciate your comments on the beauty of that exploration. One of the hard parts, though, is as a Christian, we believe the essentialness of Christianity is the way, the truth, and the life. And part of their deconstruction was denying the validity of the resurrection of Christ. So while I appreciate a deeper dive into truth, can we ever, as Christians, can we ever fully arrive at it and deny that in the process?
Mic drop.
No, I can put on a different hat, if you will.
Do it.
Let's just put on the liberal Christianity hat. So this is a form of...
Or progressive if liberal is an offensive
No,
word.
it's not liberal like... this is more... better called liberal historically because it's using critical historical methods and so on to examine historicity of the Bible and so on. It's a long-standing tradition going, back to the 16th, 17th, 18th century kind of thing.
Not just using the Bible to prove itself.
Right. So questions about the Bible and so on and saying, hey, is what we see in the Bible actually historically true and so on? There's a whole tradition that would say that has come to the conclusion. Now, again, this is not the evangelical position, broadly speaking, whatsoever. But there are Christians, as they would call them at least, and I'm not challenging that necessarily. I'm just saying self-professing Christians who do not believe the Bible is straightforwardly the literal word of God in some sense, but that it speaks God's truth in its text, and that we should not take everything literally, and that is consistent with their faith. That is a perspective that is there, and in that sense, there are plenty of people that would consider themselves Christians who would not believe that. Evangelicals do not. They would take that to be essential. If Christ is not raised, our faith is useless, whatever Paul says, and they would take that to mean, they also believe the stories have to be historically true, and not just a nice story. So I don't know exactly where the question was, but can we still be Christian and not believe something like that? And so they're rejecting it. So therefore, is that an unchristian move?
You're saying that
in some respects, just in terms of getting the definitions out there, in some respects, not necessarily, but in the evangelical sense, absolutely. Does that make sense? In an orthodox sense, absolutely.
You kind of touched on two things separately. So one is an absolute, we would call literal inerrancy of Scripture. Like every single word is exactly, literally
Sure.
The way Eugene Peterson wrote it.
Placed by God, And then like our faith tradition, which we talked about the other night, believes in the Bible is inerrant in revelation.
Soteriological inerrancy.
Yeah. So it's God's story of God's redemption of God's people. But that doesn't mean that every single word in the Bible is meant to be taken literally. Like a day may not necessarily be a day,
Sure.
That's a little different to me.
It is.
Than
there's a whole spectrum.
Not believing in the resurrection of Christ, which is there a more essential ingredient to Christianity than the crucifixion and resurrection?
No, and then I would break this down to people distinguish, and just because it's useful language. Again,
is there a liberal form of Christianity?
Absolutely. The rejection of resurrection of Christ. In historical forms, I don't think explicitly, but a lot of people will differentiate the Jesus of history, the Christ of faith. Okay, and that's a useful distinction theologically because we could say the Jesus of history did not rise from the dead. This would be the liberal Christian. Some liberal Christian arguments, and by liberal I don't mean I vote Democrat.
Right.
Okay, I mean a certain tradition of historical criticism.
Yeah.
And the Christ of faith says there's some kind of larger level at which the resurrection is a central doctrine as a kind of in the larger meaning system of Christianity. And so you could not be a Christian and reject the doctrine of the resurrection in any tradition, in any religious sense, because that's no longer Christianity in any sense. In the evangelical circle, you have to have that and the kind of literal historical sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm saying sense a lot. So the answer is, in evangelicalism, if Christ is not historically dead, well, first a person, then crucified and raised, then our faith is useless and there is no Christianity. For others, it's the Christ of faith, whatever was history, and that is its own thing. And so that would be the large answer to that. So that's two answers. But do you see how that's different for?
I do, but essentially you're referring to that as a liberal progressive version of Christianity.
Yes.
I would refer to that as Gnosticism.
Okay.
Because you're separating a bodily resurrection from a spiritual faith resurrection. You know.
Right. Yeah, there's some Gnosticism.
And to me, that's
that.
like
I can see that.
I don't know that I would attach the word Christianity to that belief system.
Sure.
But you're saying essentially that is, and I'm not saying
that is a Christianity.
I'm not saying you believe that personally. I'm just saying
right.
in your description, you almost attach that belief system in some way to the journey that Rhett and Link are taking.
For sure.
And diving deeper into God.
It's a move toward liberal Christianity, absolutely. And,
that
liberal
liberal
Christianity would see that as, okay, all good.
Yep.
You would go to an Episcopal priest somewhere in New Jersey, let's say, one of those coasts, and they'd be like, what's wrong with Rhett? That's what I believe.
Well, it's funny, though, because
absolutely.
I would be curious to ask one of those, and I don't know how much you know about this, but I don't, in our circle of Christianity, discontinuing referring to yourself as a Christian and taking on this title of hopeful agnostic, in some ways we would equate to basically denouncing your faith completely.
Yes.
That we would equate that to Peter's denial.
Mm-hmm.
And, and back to Renee's point, Peter was redeemed from that denial. So we're not saying that that's outside the realm of possibility. We're just saying, like, in our, so I would be curious, in a liberal theological world, would that be equated the same? If I take on this title of a hopeful agnostic or description of myself, is that the same as laying down my faith?
Well, and in my understanding of faith, and I think I know where Aaron would go with this, but you're buttoned right up against universalism at that point.
Yeah. Well, and I think that Rhett and Link definitely go more that route. I mean, they express some liberal views. With the culture they're more immersed in LA, Southern California, views on LGBTQ and all that. That's definitely, and especially we showed a video last night on their views on hell. That they talk about, and we can share this video, but they talk about how could a good and loving God create a place like that and send people to their eternal torment, stuff like that, which is a very universalist viewpoint.
And that's it's a hard thing to hold in tandem with the narrow gate that Jesus talks about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was kind of the point I was getting at. I'm curious about something. I'm glad you went down this road. I'm
sure,
sorry.
yeah, go,
dancing. When Brad and I first started exploring this, and I think we were just thinking it through together, and I was trying to be an asset for Brad to process, because I knew Brad was going to be the one teaching. The first question I asked was, is there anything in the video or the discussion that you could relate to? Because when I pulled my defenses back, I realized there was a lot that I could relate to.
Okay.
Because I went through this period of just being exposed to more people and people from different viewpoints and stuff like that, and I started asking questions, and I was reloading those questions back to my family who didn't have answers, and a lot of these were the same questions. Is a
Yeah.
day a day? Is evolution,
Mm-hmm.
in line with God's creation?
Macro or micro.
Right.
How does that work?
So I'm curious, like, what is something from their deconstruction that you really were able to relate to and just kind of hung on to?
I mean, for me, I have a long, mostly untold journey, but I really do almost every single thing. In some sense, that doesn't mean I agree with every single thing. I've wrestled with those. The number one would be the hell discussion. I think that was interesting, and I want to make a note on the structure of this conversation as we go into this. There's a sense in which reaction conversations about these things take, especially from evangelical perspectives, and I know we transcend being pigeonholed here, but
we try to.
yes,
We try to transcend pigeonholing or duckholing.
that somehow let's talk about how this journey away and how they can maybe come back. It presupposes there's nothing to be gained from discarding the bad with the good. It presupposes that, no, you're pretty much already right. And I think that's implicit in a lot of these conversations. And for
That's
me,
fair.
and so like when they reject, talk about hell and so on, I think the traditional evangelical position on hell is disgusting and monstrous. So good for them for rejecting that form of hell. And so but the normal form of talking about this conversation would be, well, it's a tough thing and so on. We do not gain from saying, no, we kind of have it. And then, we all float a little bit. We come back to the center and that's the structure of it. But I think one of the major things, for instance, I have gained through some of these journeys, is a rejection of some of those things. This is not a rejection of hell in general, but a typical narrative of that. And I think that is fundamental for growth, not just because we need to grow and have a nuanced opinion, because there's things in our tradition, whether we like it or not, that are not consistent with reality in how we live them and how we talk about good and loving and just and so on. And so I think that was one. I know that's going to be there's a point there, and that could open up anywhere. But so for me, when I heard that, I was like, yep, can't get away from that. And most people ignore it because they're safe. They're safe in the boat. And I think the God that truly calls us out of the boat, calls us to not stay safe in our doctrines that we hold on to, cling for security, not because they're not necessary. We have to be able to have those things as well. But that narrative is not simply follow me through all these narrow things you've been given that you're right all along. Let me show you how you're right all along. And I think that willingness to discard certain versions of things is essential, and it's not enough. It's not seen in the church because we want to pacify people. We don't talk about hell because we want to pacify them. It's difficult. We don't talk about it because we don't know how to talk about it. Sorry, that was soapbox.
No, it was a great soapbox and a great way to close out, because
Oh, geez.
if we
We'll leave on that note.
we will leave on that note, because St. Augustine said it so beautifully: in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity. And that's what we hope you take away from today. If you held on and stuck with us through this time, what are those things you deem essential to your faith and essential to those who share a faith with you? What are not essential? What are things that there's wiggle room on, that there's uncertainty about, that there's questions that remain, and that you don't have to hold with your fellow brother or sister to say, but we follow the same Jesus, and we understand that to be true. And then in all things, we hope you give grace and charity. So for Ministry Chemistry this week, I'm Renee.
Still Mike.
Aaron.
And Brad.
We'll talk to you next time.